Welcome to A Year of War and Peace. I'm your host, Brian E. Denton. A Year of War and Peace is a daily, year-long, chapter-by-chapter reading of and meditation on Leo Tolstoy's epic novel, War and Peace. In these videos and podcasts, you'll be treated to a free reading of one chapter per day of the novel, plus a reflective essay I've written individually tailored to that day's chapter. These readings are offered for free, though if you'd like to support me, you can do so in one of three ways. First, you could purchase my ebook, A Year of War and Peace. It features the entire novel, plus all of my reflective essays, and it's only $2.99 on Amazon.com. You could also become a patron at patreon.com/Brian E. Denton. If you sign up there, you'll receive a sonnet once a month, plus a link to an ebook of my collected sonnets. Finally, if you like, you can make a one-time donation to my PayPal account. The email there is brianedenton@gmail.com. You can also use that email to contact me. I'd be happy to hear from you. Your support is greatly appreciated. Today's reading and reflection is from Chapter 350. Chapter 350. History is the life of nations and of humanity. To seize and put into words, to describe directly the life of humanity, or even of a single nation, appears impossible. The ancient historians all employed one and the same method to describe and seize the apparently elusive, the life of a people. They described the activity of individuals who ruled the people and regarded the activity of those men as representing the activity of the whole nation. The questions, how did individuals make nations act as they wished, and by what was the will of these individuals themselves guided? The ancients met by recognizing a divinity which subjected the nations to the will of a chosen man, and guided the will of that chosen man so as to accomplish ends that were predestined. For the ancients, these questions were solved by a belief in the direct participation of the deity in human affairs. Modern history, in theory, rejects both these principles. It would seem that having rejected the belief of the ancients and man's subjection to the deity, and in a predetermined aim toward which the nations are led, modern history should study not the manifestations of power, but the causes that produce it. But modern history has not done this. Having in theory rejected the view held by the ancients, it still follows them in practice. Instead of men endowed with divine authority and directly guided by the will of God, modern history has given us either heroes endowed with extraordinary superhuman capacities, or simply men of various kinds, from monarchs to journalists, who lead the masses. Instead of the former divinely appointed aims of the Jewish, Greek, or Roman nations, which ancient historians regarded as representing the progress of humanity, modern history has postulated its own aims, the welfare of the French, German, or English people, or, in the highest abstraction, the welfare and civilization of humanity in general, by which it usually meant that of the peoples occupying a small, northwesterly portion of a large continent. Modern history has rejected the beliefs of the ancients without replacing them by a new conception, and the logic of the situation has obliged the historians, after they had apparently rejected the divine authority of the kings and the fate of the ancients, to reach the same conclusion by another road, that is, to recognize 1. Nations guided by individual men, and 2. The existence of a known aim to which these nations and humanity at large are tending. At the basis of the works of all the modern historians, from Gibbon to Buckle, despite their seeming disagreements and the apparent novelty of their outlooks, lie these two old, unavoidable assumptions. In the first place, the historian describes the activity of individuals who, in his opinion, have directed humanity. One historian considers only monarchs, generals, and ministers as being such men, while another includes also orators, learned men, reformers, philosophers, and poets. Secondly, it is assumed that the goal towards which humanity is being led is known to the historians. To one of them, this goal is the greatness of the Roman, Spanish, or French realm. To another, it is liberty, equality, and a certain kind of civilization of a small corner of the world called Europe. In 1789, a ferment arises in Paris. It grows, spreads, and is expressed by a movement of peoples from west to east. Several times it moves eastward and collides with a counter-movement from the east westward. In 1812 it reaches an extreme limit, Moscow, and then, with remarkable symmetry, a a counter-movement occurs from east to west, attracting to it, as the first movement had done, the nations of Middle Europe. The counter-movement reaches the starting point of the first movement in the west, Paris, and subsides. During that 20-year period, an immense number of fields were left untilled. Houses were burned, trade changed its directions, millions of men migrated, were impoverished, or were enriched, and millions of Christian men, professing the law of love on their fellows, slew one another. What does all this mean? Why did it happen? What made those people burn houses and slay their fellow men? What were the causes of these events? What forces men to act so? These are the instinctive, plain, and most legitimate questions humanity asks itself when it encounters the monuments and tradition of that period. For a reply to these questions, the common sense of mankind turns to the science of history, whose aim is to enable nations and humanity to know themselves. If history had retained the conception of the ancients, it would have said that God, to reward or punish his people, gave Napoleon power and directed his will to the fulfillment of divine ends, and that reply would have been clear and complete. One might believe or disbelieve in the divine significance of Napoleon, but for anyone believing in it there would have been nothing unintelligible in the history of that period, nor would there have been any contradictions. But modern history cannot give that reply. Science does not admit the conception of the ancients as to the direct participation of the deity in human affairs, and therefore history ought to give other answers. Modern history, replying to these questions, says, "You want to know what this movement means, what caused it, and what forces produced these events? Then listen. Louis XIV was a very proud and self-confident man. He had such and such mistresses and such ministers, and he ruled France badly. His descendants were weak men, and they too ruled France badly. And they had such and such favorites and such mistresses. Moreover, certain men wrote some books at that time. At the end of the 18th century, there were a couple dozen men in Paris who began to talk about all men being free and equal. This caused people all over France to begin to slash at and drown one another. They killed the king and many other people. At that time, there was in France a man of genius, Napoleon. He conquered everybody everywhere. That is, he killed many people because he was a great genius. And for some reason, he went to kill Africans, and killed them so well, and was so cunning and wise, that when he returned to France, he ordered everybody to obey him, and they all obeyed him. Having become an emperor, he again went out to kill people in Italy, Austria, and Prussia, and there too he killed a great many. In Russia there was an emperor, Alexander, who decided to restore order in Europe, and therefore fought against Napoleon. In 1807 he suddenly made friends with him, but in 1811 they again quarreled, and again began killing many people. Napoleon led 600,000 men into Russia and captured Moscow. Then he suddenly ran away from Moscow, and the Emperor Alexander, helped by the advice of Stein and others, united Europe to arm against the disturber of its peace. All Napoleon's allies suddenly became his enemies, and their forces advanced against the fresh forces he raised. The Allies defeated Napoleon, entered Paris, forced Napoleon to abdicate, and sent him to the island of Elba, not depriving him of the title of emperor, and showing him every respect, though 5 years before they had all regarded him as an outlaw and a brigand. Then Louis XVIII, who till then had been the laughingstock both of the French and the Allies, began to reign. And Napoleon, shedding tears before his old guards, renounced the throne and went into exile. Then the skillful statesmen and diplomatists, especially Talleyrand, who managed to sit down in a particular chair before anyone else and thereby extended the frontiers of France, talked in Vienna, and by these conversations made the nations happy or unhappy. Suddenly, the diplomatists and monarchs nearly quarreled, and were on the point of again ordering their armies to kill one another. But just then Napoleon arrived in France with a battalion, and the French, who had been hating him, immediately all submitted to him. But the allied monarchs were angry at this, and went to fight the French once more. And they defeated the genius Napoleon, and suddenly recognized him as a brigand, sent him to the island of St. Helena. And the exile, separated from the beloved France so dear to his art. Why do you keep saying heart? Or art? And the exile, separated from the beloved France so dear to his heart, died a lingering death on that rock, and bequeathed his great deeds to posterity. But in Europe a reaction occurred, and the sovereigns once again all began to oppress their subjects. It would be a mistake to think that this is ironic, a caricature of the historical accounts. On the contrary, it is a very mild expression of the contradictory replies, not meeting the questions which all the historians give, from the compilers of memoirs and the histories of separate states to the writers of general histories and the new histories of the culture of that period. The strangeness and absurdity of these replies arises from the fact that modern history, like a deaf man, answers questions no one has asked. If the purpose of history is to give a description of the movement of humanity and of the people, the first question, in the absence of a reply to which all the rest will be incomprehensible, is, what is the power that moves people? To this, modern history laboriously replies either that Napoleon was a great genius, or that Louis XIV was very proud, or that certain writers wrote certain books. All that may be so, and mankind is ready to agree with it, but it is not what was asked. All that would be interesting if we recognized a divine power based on itself and always consistently directing its nations through Napoleons, Louises, and writers. But we do not acknowledge such a power, and therefore, before speaking about Napoleon, Louises, and authors, we ought to be shown the connection existing between these men and the movement of nations. If instead of a divine power some other force has appeared, it should be explained in what this new force consists, for the whole interest of history lies precisely in that force. History seems to assume that this force is self-evident and known to everyone. But in spite of every desire to regard it as known, anyone reading many historical works cannot help doubting whether this new force, so variously understood by the historians themselves, is really quite well known to everybody. All right, that concludes my reading of chapter 350. I will now proceed to my reflection on the same. A Year of War and Peace, Day 350, Blind Accidents. Historians work with the most film noirish of content. Their subject is elusive, shifting in dusky menace, and yet liable to an opaque, brutal fatalism. A certain moodiness, more bleak than optimistic, blankets their work. Resting at the center of it all is an enduring mystery. Tolstoy invites us to consider that mystery today. For Tolstoy, there is an unknown, perhaps wholly unintelligible force animating the movements of history. The ancients, he says, locate this force in the gods who direct feeble men towards a predestined end. The moderns, on the other hand, reject deities as causal explanations for the motives of history. But, like Jonathan Harker says, the old centuries have powers of their own, which mere modernity cannot kill. So though the moderns discount the gods, they simply substitute great men into the role of gods. There remains still the mystery of the ultimate cause. The historians have solved nothing. Their impossible grasping must, on some level, be familiar to everyone. How often, after all, is our understanding altered either by the focus gathered of time or the insight gleaned from new experience? How quickly do our old certainties crumble? How fickle is truth? Nothing is spared the splintering terpsichorean march of history. In the end, perhaps our fruitless appetency for understanding in the shifting world is like Doc Reitenschneider's reflection on the double-cross he suffers in the asphalt jungle. Put in hours and hours of planning, he says. Figure everything down to the last detail. Then what? Burglar alarms start going off all over the place, for no sensible reason. A gun fires of its own accord and a man is shot. And a broken-down old cop, no good for anything but chasing kids, has to trip over us. Blind accident. What can you do against blind accidents? Daily meditation. The rottenness of the matter, which is the foundation of everything. Water, dust, bones, filth, or again, marble rocks. The calicities of the earth, and gold and silver, the sediments of garments. Only bits of hair and purple dye, blood. and everything else is of the same kind. And that which is of the nature of breath is also another thing of the same kind, changing from this to that. Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. All right, so that concludes my reading of chapter 350 of War and Peace. Thanks so much for listening. Remember that if you'd like to support me, you can do so either by purchasing the ebook Year of War and Peace, becoming a patron at patreon.com, or making a one-time donation at PayPal. The links to all that are down below in the show notes, alongside my Amazon wishlist for books and movies. If you'd like to purchase me one of those, we'll set up a Zoom call to discuss that book or that movie. Tomorrow, we're going to be reading and reflecting on chapter 351 of War and Peace. I hope you'll join me. Until then, take care of yourselves and others.